Some secrets a man can bury so deep he convinces himself they no longer exist, until the day one steps off a train. January 1876. A man digs a grave through the night, hands bleeding into the frozen Montana ground. He does not weep, because the one lying in the cabin behind him can no longer hear 6 years pass in the back of his barn, behind 3 coils of fence wire on the highest shelf. There is something he never touches, something he never looks at directly, something the entire valley does not know still exists. Only he knows, until one September afternoon in 1882. The Northern Pacific screams into the Billings Depot. A stranger steps down onto the platform. She has come 2,000 miles. She has never set foot in Montana. She has never heard his name. And yet, pressed against her left forearm, is something that looks exactly like the thing hidden in his barn. The same scratch, the same place. She sets down her suitcase, looks him dead in the eye, and speaks one sentence, only one, that leaves him frozen in the middle of the platform. Stellan Voss did not believe in wasting words, not on strangers, not on neighbors, not on the sky, which was vast and indifferent, and had never once answered him back. He believed in fences that held, water that ran clean, ground that gave back what you put into it. He believed in the weight of a good axe in the hand, and the specific silence of a Montana morning before the wind picked up and reminded you that you were very small and very alone on a very large piece of earth. He did not believe in marriage, not anymore. He had believed in it once, deeply, in the particular and irreversible way that a man believes in something he has held and lost. But that was before January of 1876. Before 11 days of fever in a cabin cut off by snow. Before he dug a grave in frozen ground with a pickaxe because a shovel was useless, and the earth did not care about his grief, and neither did the weather. After Ragna, Stellan Voss stopped believing in a great many things. What he believed in now was the list. He wrote it on a Tuesday evening in July of 1882, sitting at the same table where he had eaten every meal alone for 6 years. The kerosene lamp threw yellow light across the paper. Outside, the Yellowstone Valley lay quiet and enormous under a sky going purple at the edges. He dipped the pen. He wrote, seeking. A woman of sound health and constitution must tolerate cold winters and significant isolation. Experience in domestic management preferred. Age between 25 and 35. Good temperament. Willingness to relocate to Montana Territory required. He read it back. He changed good temperament to practical disposition. Then he folded the letter and addressed it to the Fargo Domestic Agency in North Dakota, which had been recommended to him by Aldous Crew, his nearest neighbor, who lived 60 miles east, and whose opinion Stellan neither sought nor particularly wanted, but sometimes received anyway. He did not mention love. He did not mention companionship. He mentioned that the winters were cold, and that a woman who could not handle elation should not apply. This seemed honest. This seemed sufficient. He sealed the envelope and set it by the door to post in the morning, and went to bed and slept the way he always slept. Still, completely alone, without dreaming, Aldous Crew arrived 3 days later, as he occasionally did, unannounced and unhurried, the way old ranchers arrive. Like weather, like a geological event, like something you cannot prevent and must simply endure. He came in without knocking. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove. He sat down, across from Stellan, and looked at him for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man who has something to say and is going to say it whether or not you want him to. "You post that letter?" Aldous asked. "Yesterday." Aldous wrapped both hands around the mug. 60 years old, broad as a barn door, with a beard that had given up having a shape sometime around 1870. He looked at Stellan the way you look at a fence post that is leaning slightly and will eventually fall over if nobody does anything about it. "You know what you sound like in that letter? A man looking for a wife. A man looking for a mule." Aldous set the mug down. "Good constitution. Tolerates cold. Practical disposition." He said the last two words the way you say something you have found stuck to the bottom of your boot. You write that about a woman, Stellan. I wrote it about what I need. You wrote it about livestock. Silence. Stellan looked at his coffee. Aldous looked at Stellan. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, in a long, slow wave, the way it always doing. Since before either of them was born, and would keep doing long after both of them were gone. I buried Ragna in 1876, Stellan said finally. Not angry, just factual, the way you state the weather. I'm not looking to replace her. I'm looking for someone to help run this place. That's honest. That's what I have to offer. Aldous picked up his mug again. He looked into it. Honest, he said. Sure. He did not say anything else about it. But when he left an hour later, he paused at the door and looked back at Stellan, with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite frustration, but lived somewhere in between, in the particular territory, occupied by men who watch other men make decisions they cannot quite stop. Just don't, Aldous said. Be surprised when she's a person. Then he left. Stellan stood at the window and watched the old man ride east until he disappeared into the grass and the distance and the enormous indifferent afternoon. He did not know what that meant. He thought he probably did not want to know. There are things Stellan Voss did not talk about. This was not unusual for a man of his time and place. Men on the Montana frontier in 1882 did not, as a general rule, discuss their interior lives. They discussed weather and water rights, and the price of beef in Billings, and whether the Northern Pacific was going to keep expanding west. They discussed practical things, necessary things. They did not discuss the fact that, sometimes, on winter evenings when the wind was particularly loud, a man might pick up a book and then set it back down without reading it, because the silence in the room was a specific kind of silence. The kind that used to be filled with something, and now was not. And the difference between those two kinds of silence was a distance you could not cross and a weight you could not put down. Stellan Voss did not discuss this. He had, in fact, become remarkably skilled at not discussing anything. What he was less skilled at was how to explain that the silence was not peace. That what looked like contentment from the outside was something considerably more complicated from the inside side. That he had stopped believing in warmth, not because he thought it was foolish, but because he had held it once, and then had to watch it go cold. And some lessons you learn so completely that you stop being willing to be taught them again. He was 47 years old. He had been alone for 6 years. He was, by every visible measure, fine. In the back of the barn, on a shelf behind 3 coils of fence wire and a broken collar harness, there was a violin case, black leather, brass latches. A scratch along the left side from the winter of 1874, when Ragna had carried it through a doorway too quickly and caught the edge of the frame. Stellan walked past that shelf every day. He had walked past it every day for 6 years. He did not open the case. He did not move the case. He did not touch the case. He occasionally looked at it, the way you look at a thing that you are not looking at. The specific practiced not looking of a man who has made a decision and intends to keep making it. Inside the case was a violin, spruce top, maple back. A small label inside read, Mittenwald, Bavaria, 1861. Ragna had brought it from Norway when she was 19. She had carried it across the Atlantic and across half of America and into a cabin in the Yellowstone Valley. And she had played it every Sunday evening, badly and joyfully, because she loved it. Not because she was good at it. She knew she was not good at it. She played anyway. Stellan used to sit outside on the porch and listen through the wall, not because he wanted distance, because if he sat inside she would stop. She was self-conscious. She thought she was bothering him. And no matter how many times Howard told her she was not bothering him, she would still stop if she caught him listening. So he sat outside. Through the log wall and the lamplit winter air came the sound of her playing. Imperfect, alive, his. He sat outside and listened through the wall. for 6 years of Sunday evenings. And then there were no more Sunday evenings. And the violin went on the shelf in the barn. And Stellan Voss stopped being the kind of man who sat on porches and listened to music through walls, because that man belonged to a version of his life that was finished. And there was no use in keeping furniture from a house that had burned down. This was not grief. This was management. This was how you kept going. The reply from the Fargo Domestic Agency arrived in August. They had a match. Her name was Beatrix Kaufmann. Age 30, German descent, born in Ohio, most recently residing in Cincinnati, in good health, experienced in household management. Willing to relocate, the agency's description was brief. Miss Kaufmann is a capable woman of steady character and practical inclination. She is willing to consider a placement in Montana Territory and has reviewed your particulars. Stellan read the letter twice. He wrote back the same day. He said, "Send her." He did not ask what she looked like. He did not ask what she wanted. He asked one practical question. What date can she arrive? The agency replied, September 14th, Northern Pacific, Billings Depot. She'll be in the blue dress. Stellan wrote that date on the wall calendar, beside the kitchen door, the same wall calendar where he wrote the date of first frost and the date of spring thaw and the dates of cattle sales in Billings. September 14. B. Kaufmann. Billings. He looked at it. Then he went back outside to fix the fence on the north pasture. Because the fence needed fixing and the fence would not fix itself. And this was, when you came down to it, how most things got done. He did almost nothing to prepare. He swept the floors. He aired out the second bedroom, the one that had been a storage room for 3 years, then a spare room for another 3 years, then a room that he walked past without looking into, in the same way he walked past the violin in the barn. He moved the boxes out. He put in a bed frame and a mattress he had ordered from a catalog in June, which had arrived in August, which he had left leaning against the barn wall for 6 weeks, because bringing it inside felt like a decision he was not entirely ready to make. He brought it inside on September 10th. He made the bed with 2 quilts, both serviceable, neither particularly welcoming. He stood back and looked at the room. It was clean. It was functional. It was the kind of room a practical man, with a practical disposition, would prepare for a woman he had described as livestock in a letter. He went back outside. He thought about what Aldous had said. Just don't be surprised when she's a person. What an irritating thing to say. What an obvious thing to say. Of course, she was going to be a person. He was not an idiot. September 14th, 1882. Billings Depot. 2:15 in the afternoon. The Northern Pacific came in from the east, with its usual indifference to poetry. Smoke and noise and the grinding of steel on steel. The platform filling with the particular chaos of arrivals. Trunks being unloaded, children running, men calling to each other across the crowd. Stellan stood at the edge of the platform, with a piece of paper that had her name on it. B. Kaufmann. He held it the way he held a livestock brand, functionally, without flourish. He was looking for a woman in a blue dress. He did not expect much. She came off the train third from the end of the car. Blue dress. Yes, but not. Not what he had pictured. Not the plain, serviceable, practical blue of a woman who had read his letter and understood what she was coming to. This was a blue that had opinions. A blue that had, at some point in its life, been to places where people dressed for reasons other than weather protection. It was slightly, just slightly, too fine for a train platform in Billings, Montana, in September of 1882. She was tall. She carried 2 large suitcases, carried them herself without asking for help, without looking around for someone to ask. And in her right hand, balanced against her forearm with the ease of long practice, a black leather violin case with a scratch along the left side. She stopped on the platform and looked around with the systematic attention of someone assessing a new situation. Not nervous, not uncertain. Taking inventory, her gaze landed on Stellan, on the paper in his hand, On his face, she walked toward him. He had spent 6 years not being surprised by anything. She stopped 2 feet in front of him and looked at him with dark eyes that were, he would think later, the most direct eyes he had ever encountered on any living creature, including cattle. And cattle could be very direct. She said, "You're shorter than your photograph suggested." He said nothing. "But your chin is better in person." She transferred the violin case to her left hand and extended her right. "Beatrix Kaufmann." He shook her hand. "Stellan Voss, I know." She looked at the paper he was still holding with her name on it. "You can put that away." He put it in his pocket. She picked up both suitcases. "Where is the wagon?" The ride to the homestead was 42 miles. Stellan had made this drive so many times that he no longer saw it. The roll of the grassland, the long sweep of the valley, the Beartooth Range going blue-gray in the distance. It was simply the road home. Familiar as his own hands, Beatrix Kaufmann had never seen it before. She sat beside him on the wagon bench and looked at everything. Not the nervous looking of a woman trying to assess what she had gotten herself into. The looking of a person who is genuinely paying attention to the world. She asked the first question 5 minutes out of Billings. "How many acres?" 640. "How much is under cultivation?" "About 80. "Rest is grazing." "Water source?" "Creek runs through the east pasture." "Doesn't dry up." "Nearest neighbor?" "Aldous Crew." 60 miles east. "Nearest town?" "Miles City." 90 miles. "Nearest church?" He looked at her. 90 miles, he said. She processed this without apparent distress. "Nearest lending library?" "No." She absorbed this. Made a small sound that was not quite disappointment and not quite resignation, but lived somewhere in between. They rode in silence for a moment then. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" He did not answer. She looked at him. He was looking at the road. The horses moved at their steady pace. The grass moved in the wind. The sky was the enormous, indifferent sky. She did not ask again, but she noted it. He could tell. She noted it. The way you can tell when someone is filing something away. And she turned back to watching the valley. And they rode in silence for a while, and the silence was not uncomfortable exactly. It was simply very full. She cooked supper that first evening without being asked, without discussing it. She went into the kitchen, inspected it briefly, opened several cabinets with the systematic efficiency of a general reviewing unfamiliar terrain, and then she cooked. The result was remarkable. Not because Stellan had low expectations, exactly. More because he had not had expectations at all, and whatever he had unconsciously assumed had been replaced, without warning, by pork with onions, and roasted potatoes, and something with apples. That was not quite a dessert, but was not quite not a dessert either, and all of it was considerably better than anything that had come out of that kitchen in 6 years. He ate without commenting. This was how he ate, in silence, with focus. Food was fuel, and meals were maintenance, and he had never seen the point of narrating the experience. She watched him eat, not rudely, just observationally, the way she had watched the valley on the drive out, taking inventory. When he put down his fork, she folded her hands on the table. "We should discuss terms," she said. He looked up. "Terms. I've traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man I have never met." She said it without drama. Pure logistics. "This is a business arrangement. We should discuss it like adults before we proceed." He had not thought of it as a business arrangement. He had thought of it as a practical solution to a practical problem. The distinction, he realized, might be smaller than he'd assumed. "All right," he said. She held up one finger. "A room of my own until we are properly married." "You have 1, 2 fingers." "A bookshelf." He said nothing. 3 fingers. "The right to say no to anything, without explanation required." He looked at her across the table. This woman, who had arrived with 2 suitcases and a violin and 14 questions and opinions about his chin, who had cooked a meal that was, by any honest assessment, substantially better than he deserved, who was now sitting at his table, outlining her conditions with the calm precision of a woman, who had thought carefully about what she needed and had decided not to apologize for it. He thought about what he had written in that letter. Good temperament. Practical disposition. He thought about what Aldous had said. He said, "The room you already have. The bookshelf I'll build." He paused. "The right to say no is already yours. It doesn't require my permission." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatically. Not in the way things shift in stories. Quietly. "The way it shifts when a cloud moves," she said. "That was the right answer," he said. "I know." It was the most words Stellan Voss had spoken in a single evening in 6 years. He was not entirely sure how that had happened. He showed her the room. Clean, functional, 2 quilts. A window facing west, which in the evenings would fill with the particular gold light that came off the grassland when the sun was going down. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He went to his own room. He did not sleep for some time. He lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house, which was a thing he had stopped doing years ago, because the sounds of the house were simply the sounds of an empty house, which was to say, not many sounds, which was to say, silence wearing different costumes. But tonight the house had different sounds. Footsteps, light and deliberate, moving across the kitchen floor. The sound of a cabinet opening. Water being poured. Footsteps returning. A door closing softly. Then, through the log wall of his house, in the particular way sound untravels through wood on a still September night, music. Faint. A violin. She was playing quietly, trying not to be heard, and the result was something muted and careful. A Brahms intermezzo or something like it, slow and grave. The kind of music that is not sad exactly, but knows that sadness exists and does not look away from it. Stellan lay in the dark and listened. He had not heard music in this house in 6 years. He had not heard a violin in this house in 6 years. He was not thinking about Ragna. He was thinking. And this surprised him, landed sideways. Came from a direction he had not been watching. He was thinking that he had forgotten. He had genuinely forgotten what it sounded like when a house had music in it. What it felt like when the silence was not simply silence, but was silence with something inside it, the way a room feels different when someone is in the next room, even if you cannot see them. He had forgotten that a house could have that. He lay there. He listened. He did not name what he was feeling. That seemed wise. There was a document on the table in her room. She found it that first night, after she had finished playing, after the music had settled into silence, and the house had gone still. A single fold sheet of paper, on the small table beside the window, placed with enough deliberateness that it was clearly meant to be found, not forgotten. She unfolded it. Read it. Read it again. It was a contract. Not a legal document in the formal sense. No lawyer's hand, no official seal. Just Stellan Voss's handwriting, which was precise and slightly angular, the handwriting of a man who learned English as a second language and took the letters seriously. 1 page, 7 clauses. The party of the second part retains full ownership of any personal property brought to the homestead upon arrival, and any property acquired thereafter in her own name. Either party may, after a period of 1 calendar year, dissolve this arrangement without legal penalty to either side. Should it prove incompatible for reasons, either party may decline to specify. The party of the second part shall not be required to bear children should her health or her determination not to do so prevail. This is her determination to make, not his. She read that last sentence 3 times. This is her determination to make, not his. She sat down on the edge of the bed. The lamp was low. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and absolutely dark, the kind of dark that cities do not have, the kind of dark that reminds you that the light you live by is borrowed and local, and the rest of the world does not require it. She had come to Montana because she had no money and no teaching position, and a landlady in Cincinnati who needed her room back by October. She had come because the alternative was returning to relatives in Columbus who would spend the next decade asking her what had gone wrong, and why she had never married, and whether she had considered that perhaps she was too forthright for most men's comfort. She had come with 2 suitcases and a violin, and absolutely no expectation of this. This document, written by a man who had described himself in a letter with the warmth of a tax assessment. Written by a man who had picked her up at a train station and spoken approximately 30 words in the hour and a half it took to reach this homestead. Written by a man who could not, apparently, produce the word bookshelf in response to her request without having to think about it for several seconds. That man had written, "This is her determination to make, not his." She sat in the dark for a long time. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. She cried, not loudly, not dramatically, simply a quiet rearrangement of her face in the direction of something she had not expected to feel in this place, in this room, on this particular Tuesday evening on the Montana frontier. She had come expecting a transaction. She had found, in 7 clauses of angular handwriting, a man who understood something about dignity that a great many more charming and more talkative men had somehow failed to grasp. She folded the document carefully. She placed it in the front cover of the Tennyson she had packed in Cincinnati because she could not bear to leave it behind. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought, "I came here expecting a transaction." She thought, "I may have miscalculated what that means." She did not sleep for quite some time. But when she slept well. Morning. She restacked the woodpile before breakfast. Stellan came out of the barn at 6:30, having fed the horses and checked the east fence, and found her in the yard with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, moving his wood with the systematic focus of someone who has identified a problem and finds waiting for someone else to solve it inefficient. She had made genuine progress. He stood and watched. She reached the end of her row, straightened, turned, and found him there. She did not apologize. She did not explain. She looked at him with the direct, undefended expression that he was beginning to recognize as simply how her face worked when she was engaged with something real. "Air needs to circulate," she said. "Bottom row off the ground. Gaps between every 3rd piece." He looked at the woodpile. He looked at her. "You've done this before," he said. "My father heated with wood. 4 Ohio winters." She rolled her sleeve back down. "Should take another hour to finish." He said nothing. He went inside. He came back 20 minutes later with 2 mugs of coffee. He set one on the fence post beside her without comment and picked up a piece of wood and began stacking from the other end. They worked in silence for 45 minutes. Neither said anything. This was, Stellan would later realize, also the beginning of something. He just did not have a word for it yet. He built the bookshelf 4 days later. He built it from pine, which was what he had. He planed it by hand, which took longer than it needed to, and he would not have been able to say precisely why he was taking the time he was taking. It was 3 shelves. It was functional. He could have built it in 2 hours. It took him most of a day, because at some point in the building of it, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd shelf, in the late afternoon, when the light was coming through the barn door at a low angle and making the fresh-cut pine look like something worth looking at, he found himself adding a detail to the front edge of each shelf, a carved border, simple, geometric, repeating pattern. It served no structural purpose. It was not required. It was the kind of thing you add to something when you have stopped thinking of it as a shelf and started thinking of it as a gift. Though he did not quite think that thought in those words, because thinking thoughts in those words required a certain willingness to examine what you were doing that Stellan Voss was not entirely ready to apply to himself. He carried it inside. He set it against the wall of her room. She came in from outside. She had been doing something with the cold frame she was building in the kitchen garden, an enterprise he had watched with the same slightly stunned attention he gave to most of what she did, which was a great deal, efficiently, without asking for instruction or permission. She stopped in the doorway of her room. She looked at the shelf. She looked at the carved edge. She ran one finger along the pattern on the top shelf, slowly, the way you touch something you are trying to understand. She did not say thank you. She said, "You didn't have to do the carving." No, he agreed. She looked at him. He looked at the shelf. "It's good work," she said quietly. He nodded. He left. She stood in her room with her hand on the carved edge of a pine shelf and understood, the way you understand certain things, not with your mind, but with some quieter and more reliable instrument, that this was how this man said what he could not say. Not with words, with a carved border on a pine shelf that served no structural purpose. She unpacked her 12 books. She arranged them on the 3 shelves with the care of someone who is, for the first time in some months, arranging things in a place that might, possibly, turn out to be somewhere she actually lives. She played violin that evening, the same Brahms as the first night, but with the door open and Stellan Voss, who was sitting at the kitchen table doing nothing in particular, which was not something he ever did, sat there friendless. He did not go outside. They had been at the homestead for 8 days when Beatrix said the thing that Stellan had not expected. It was evening, after supper. The lamp was lit. She was at the table with a book open in front of her. Tennyson, he had noticed, the same volume she seemed to return to. And he was doing nothing, which was still a new experience, the doing of nothing in a room that had someone else in it. She looked up. "You built the shelf the morning after I arrived," she said. He looked at her. "You didn't know me. You had spoken to me for approximately 4 minutes. You didn't know if I read. You didn't know if I had books. You didn't know if I intended to stay." She looked at him steadily. "But you built the shelf." He said nothing. "Why?" she asked. He thought about this. Outside the window, the valley was dark, and the stars were doing what they always did in Montana, filling the entire sky with the particular extravagance of light that you only get when there is nothing between you and the universe. No city, no smoke, nothing at all. "You asked for it," he said. "You built it the next morning." With carving, he looked at the table. "The carving was extra," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was." She looked at him for one more moment. Then she looked back at her book. He sat there in the lamplight. The house had music in it, and books on the shelves, and someone else's coffee cup on the other side of the table, and a woodpile in the yard that was stacked correctly for the first time in 6 years. He did not name what he was feeling, but it was there. It had a weight. It had, if he was honest, and he was, in his slow and careful way, an honest man, it had something that felt, in the vicinity of its edges, almost like warmth. He had not felt warmth in a very long time, so he sat with it, and outside the Montana night pressed enormous and dark against the windows. And inside, for the first time in 6 years, the silence was not simply the silence of an empty house. It was the silence of something beginning. October came the way it always came to the Yellowstone Valley, without asking, without warning. One morning the light was gold, and the grass was still green at the roots, and the air had that particular September quality, cool enough to be comfortable, warm enough to be kind. And then the next morning you stepped outside, and the sky had changed color overnight, gone from blue to the specific gray-white of a sky that has made up its mind, and the wind had a new edge to it, a purposeful edge, the kind of edge that is not interested in your opinion on the matter. Winter was coming. It was always coming. This was simply its announcement. Stellan Voss had been watching Montana winters arrive for 11 years. He knew the signs the way he knew his own hands. The way the cattle moved closer to the windbreaks. The way the creek talked differently when the temperature dropped. The way the silence changed its quality, became denser, more insistent. The way silence gets when it knows it is going to have the place to itself for a long time. He knew all of this. What he did not know, what he had not in the planning of this arrangement accounted for, was what it would be like to watch someone else discover it for the first time. Beatrix Kaufmann stood in the yard on the first morning of October and looked at the sky. She stood there for a full minute. He watched her from the barn doorway. She pulled her shawl tighter, tilted her head slightly, like she was listening to something, like the sky was saying something to her, specifically, and she was deciding whether she believed it. Then she turned around and went back inside. 5 minutes later, she came back out with a list, written on the back of an envelope, in the precise, slightly angular handwriting that looked nothing like her personality, but was somehow completely her. She walked to the kitchen garden, stood there assessing it, made notes on her list. He watched her. He realized, watching her a great deal. This was new. He was not sure what to do about it. So he did what he always did with things he was not sure about. He went back to work. She was building a cold frame. He noticed this on the 3rd day of October. She had found scrap lumber in the barn, assessed it, selected pieces, and begun constructing what he eventually recognized as a frame for protecting winter vegetables from frost. She had not asked him. She had not told him. She had simply found a problem and found materials and was solving it. With the same focused economy she applied to everything. He came around the corner of the house on a Tuesday afternoon and found her on her knees in the dirt with a hammer, driving nails with clean, efficient strokes. Sleeves pushed up, hair slightly disordered, smear of soil along her left forearm. She did not look up. "The angle on the south face needs to be steeper," she said. "Catches more winter sun." He looked at the frame. He looked at the angle. "You've done this before," he said. For the second time, she sat back on her heels. "My mother kept a kitchen garden in Cincinnati until she died. I kept it after." She looked at the frame critically. "I'm a 1/4 inch off on the south side. It'll hold. It'll hold better if it's right." He went into the barn, came back with a mallet and a small wedge, corrected the angle without being asked. She watched him do it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. She went back to hammering. He stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he went back to his own work and did not think about it. He absolutely did not think about it. She fell off the horse on a Wednesday. The first time. She had appeared beside the corral on a Monday morning, looked at the horses with the evaluative expression she used on everything from the kitchen cabinets to the south-facing angle of the cold frame, and said, "Which one is the most patient?" He had pointed at Mabel. Mabel was 15 years old, brown, uncomplicated. She had not had an opinion about anything since approximately 1874. Beatrix had nodded and gone into the corral and begun introducing herself to the horse with the same systematic confidence she used on everything else in her life. This confidence, it turned out, did not transfer directly to horseback. The first day, she had managed to stay on Mabel for 20 minutes at a walk before the horse stopped to investigate something in the grass, and Beatrix, not yet having developed the automatic compensation of an experienced rider, simply continued forward without the horse. She landed in the grass. Completely. Stellan was at the fence. He had been watching with the particular sideways attention of a man who is pretending not to watch something while watching it absolutely. His hand came up instinctively toward the fence rail. He stopped himself. She was already getting up. No sound, no comment, no look in his direction. She stood, brushed her skirt, walked back to the horse, put her foot in the stirrup and went back up. He put his hand back down. She fell a second time on the following Thursday, slightly more dramatically. Mabel spooked at a ground squirrel, and the dismount was sudden and complete. This time she landed harder. He saw her sit in the grass for a moment, collecting herself. And for 1 second, one brief, very inconvenient second, he felt something that was not quite alarm and not quite concern, but lived in the same neighborhood, close enough that he could feel the heat of it. She got up. She got back on. She did not look at him. He did not say anything. But that evening he left a small tin of arnica salve on the kitchen table. No note, just the tin. In the morning it was gone. She did not mention it. He did not mention it, but he noticed that she walked slightly less stiffly on Friday than she had on Thursday, and he found this. And this was the part he could not quite account for, could not quite file away under any of the practical categories. He used to organize the contents of his days. He found this disproportionately satisfying. 3 weeks into October, she rode beside him for the first time. Not a lesson, not a declared event. He was riding out to check the east pasture fence, which the autumn wind had been testing in ways that required attention, and she simply appeared beside him on Mabel, ready, and fell into pace alongside. He said nothing. She said nothing. They rode east together in the early morning silence. The grass silvered with frost, the sky the pale clear blue of a cold October day. The Beartooth Range sat on the southern horizon, exactly where it always sat, doing exactly what it always did, being enormous and permanent, and entirely indifferent to human concerns. Beatrix looked at it. She looked at the valley, the sweep of it, the way the frost caught the low morning light and threw it back, the way the grass moved in patterns that were almost like water, the way the sky was simply more sky than she had ever seen in one place, more sky than she had thought possible, sky that went on past the point where sky usually stopped and kept going anyway. She was quiet for a long time, 2 hours approximately, which was, he had learned, not actually unusual for her. Despite the 14 questions, and the direct eyes, and the negotiations, and the documented opinions about wood stacking, she could be quiet. She was capable of a silence that was not empty. It was different from his silence. His silence was a door he kept closed. Hers was a room you could stand in. After 2 hours, she said, "This is the most beautiful place I have ever seen." He rode. "Why didn't you say so in your letter?" she asked. He thought about this, about what he had written and what he had not written and why, about the fact that he had stood on this piece of ground for 11 years and had known every morning that it was beautiful and had said this to no one, not once, not even to Ragna, not in words. Because some things you do not put into words because you are afraid that the words will be the wrong size for the thing, and then you will have failed the thing somehow. Made it smaller. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was looking at the horizon. She looked at the side of his face for a moment, the jaw, the angle of it, which was indeed better in person than in the photograph, and she thought, there is an entire man in there. Behind all that silence. There is an entire man. She turned back to the valley. They rode home in the same quiet, and the quiet, this time, was different, fuller, like a room where two people are breathing instead of one. The violin came out of the barn on a Saturday in late October. He did not plan it. He had gone into the barn to fix a collar harness, which had cracked along the left seam and needed replacing before it failed, completely at a moment that would be inconvenient. He had his tools. He had the harness. He had the focused, narrow attention of a man doing a specific thing, and then he walked past the shelf. He had walked past the shelf 10,000 times. He stopped. He looked at the case. Black leather. Brass latches. The scratch along the left side from the winter of 1874. When Ragna had carried it through a doorway too quickly. The scratch he had walked past 10,000 times without seeing because he had learned with considerable practice and considerable cost. Not to see it, he saw it today. He stood there. He thought about Beatrix playing through the log wall at night. He thought about the door open now, the Brahms settling through the house in the evenings. He thought about the fact that she played with a kind of feeling that a person plays with when music is not a performance but a need, a necessary private conversation with some part of themselves that does not have another language. He thought about Ragna playing badly and joyfully every Sunday and him sitting outside because if he went in she would stop. He had sat outside for 6 years of Sundays because if he went in she would stop. And then there were no more Sundays and he never went in, and he had never, not once, not in 6 years, allowed himself to fully calculate what that cost. What it cost a man to always be on the other side of the wall, from the thing he loves because he is afraid that the thing will stop if he gets too close. He looked at the case. He picked it up. He carried it inside. He set it on Beatrix's bookshelf. On the middle shelf, between the Tennyson and a book on agricultural science she had produced from somewhere, and was reading with what appeared to be genuine interest. He did not leave a note. He went back to the barn and fixed the harness. She found it that evening. She came into her room after supper and stopped. Looked at the case on the shelf. Went to it slowly, the way you approach something that might mean more than you are ready for it to mean. She looked at the brass latches, looked at the scratch, looked at the small dark mark on the corner of the lid that she recognized as the kind of mark that comes from years of being handled by the same hands, the same way, until the surface remembers the contact. She reached for the latch, stopped, looked at the initials pressed into the leather at the top left corner. RV. She sat on the edge of her bed. RV. Regna Voss. She understood. She understood the shelf in the barn. Understood the 6 years of walking past it. Understood the man who had carried it inside and placed it here without explanation. Because he did not have words for what he meant by it. Only the action, only the object, only the gesture of placing something he had protected and mourned and refused to touch directly into the hands of someone who might know what to do with it. She sat there for a long time. She did not open the case that night. She opened it the next morning, lifted the violin out carefully, looked at the label inside. Mittenwald, Bavaria, 1861. Ran her thumb across the strings, loose, untuned, the sound dead without tension. She found her own Rosen, restrung it carefully with the spare strings she carried, tuned it slowly, by ear in the morning quiet. She played a single long note, rich, clean. This was a good instrument, better than she had expected. She played a scale. Then she put it back. That evening she played for Stellan with both doors open. Not her Brahms, not the Schubert she had brought from Cincinnati. She played a Norwegian folk song she had learned on the train coming west from an old man in the next compartment who had played it on a small wooden flute and offered to teach her when he saw her watching. She had not known why she learned it. She knew now. She played it slowly, finding her way through the melody. In the kitchen, Stellan Voss sat very still. He had not heard that melody in 11 years. He had not heard it since Norway, since the farm where he grew up, since the valley that was not this valley, the distance of his whole life ago. He sat. He did not move, he thought. She learned this. She learned this before she knew me. She learned it on the train, coming to a place she had never been, to marry a man she had never met, from a stranger with a wooden flute. He could not have said what that meant. He only knew that it meant something. Something large. Something he was not ready to look at directly. So he sat in the kitchen and listened to her play, his country's music in his Montana house at night. And he let it happen, and he did not move, and outside the October darkness pressed enormous against the windows, and inside was warm. November arrived with intent. The cold was real now, not the polite cool of September, not the crisp clarity of October. This was the cold that meant business. That woke you at 3 in the morning, with the knowledge that the fire needed feeding. That made the horses restless, and the cattle cluster and the water in the bucket beside the door develop a film of ice by morning. Beatrix did not complain. She had not, in fact, complained about anything since arriving. This was not the same as not noticing things. She noticed everything. She had opinions about everything. She deployed those opinions with the precision of a woman who has learned that being right is not the same as being heard, and has decided to be both. But complaint, the kind of complaint that asks the world to be different from what it is, that she did not do. She added layers. She found in a trunk in the storage room a collection of wool that had belonged to. She did not ask. She used it. She produced over the course of a November week a set of practical heavy wool items that she wore without comment, and that kept her warm while she continued to do everything she had been doing. She was teaching herself to track the cattle. This had begun in October as occasional accompaniment on Stellan's fence checks. It had evolved, by November, into something more. She rode with him most mornings now. She watched how he read the herd, the way an experienced rancher looks at 100 cattle and reads them the way you read a page of text, seeing not just the individual animals but the pattern of them, the mood of the whole. She asked precise questions. He gave precise answers, which led to more questions. He found, and this surprised him, he found that he did not mind the questions. He had spent 6 years speaking almost entirely in single syllables. He had thought this was what he preferred. He had thought of silence as a property of himself, something intrinsic, like the color of his eyes or the width of his shoulders. What he was discovering in November, riding through the frost-gray mornings, with Beatrix asking precise questions beside him, was that maybe, just maybe, the silence had been less a preference and more a lack. A lack of anyone asking, a lack of anyone who wanted the answer. He thought this thought once on a cold Tuesday in the middle of November, and then he put it away before it could become anything more than a thought. Some doors you approach, and then walk past, and then come back to. He was in the walking past stage. He knew it. The man from Billings came on a Thursday. His name was Wardlow. Red Wardlow, though nobody seemed to know what that referred to, because Wardlow himself was not red in any particular way. Not his hair, not his face, not his character as far as Stellan could tell. He was a land speculator, which in 1882 meant a man who had noticed that Montana had a great deal of land, and that the northern Pacific was making all of it more valuable. He came in a wagon. He wore a coat that was too good for the weather and boots that were too good for the mud. He shook Stellan's hand with the practiced enthusiasm of a man who has shaken many hands and calculated the value of each one. He wanted the east pasture, not all of it. Just the 60 acres that ran along the creek, which had, since the railroad came through, become significantly more valuable than it had been when Stellan built his fence on it in 1871. Wardlow offered a fair price. A good price, even. He said no. Wardlow recalibrated, offered more. He said no again. Wardlow nodded, made the notes a man makes when he is recalibrating for a third attempt, shook Stellan's hand again, and drove his wagon back toward Billings. Stellan watched him go. Then he went inside. He did not mention it to Beatrix. This did not seem, at the time, like an omission. It was simply a decision about ranch business. His ranch, his pasture, his decision. This was how it had always worked. A man who runs a ranch runs a ranch. He makes decisions. He does not convene a committee. This was fine. This was completely fine. Until Friday morning. She was in the kitchen garden, checking the cold frame, when she looked up and saw the wagon tracks in the dirt. The marks where Wardlow's wagon had sat, the churned earth where his horses had stood. She looked at the tracks. She looked at the east pasture. She looked at the tracks again. She came inside. Someone was here yesterday, she said. A man from Billings. Stellan was at the stove. Land speculator. Wanted to buy the east pasture. Silence. He turned. She was looking at him. The east pasture, she said. Yes, the east pasture. Her voice had changed. Not louder, lower actually, more careful. The way a voice gets when it is managing itself. Where I built the cold frame. Where I planted the winter kale. Each word precise. Clean. Where you wrote, on a piece of paper which I still have. The east plot is yours. Do what you want with it. He was very still. You made a decision, she said. About something you had told me was mine. Without asking me, she was not shouting. She was not crying. She was looking at him with the direct, undefended expression that usually meant she was stating a fact. But this was a different kind of fact. Is this my home, Stellan? Or am I a piece of equipment you keep in it? The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the wind had picked up, the way it did in November, the specific November wind that has no interest in being gentle. I turned him down, Stellan said. I know you did. The land isn't for sale. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. That's not the point. He knew she was right. He knew it immediately, in the way you know a thing when someone says it, and the knowledge was already there, waiting. And the words are just the shape of what you already understood, but knowing you are wrong and knowing what to do about it are two different things. And Stellan Voss had not, in 47 years, developed what you might call a flexible and agile relationship with the act of admitting he had been wrong. He was working on this. He stood there. She waited. He said nothing for long enough that she set down the cloth she was holding and walked out of the kitchen. He heard her bedroom door close, not slammed, just closed. He stood at the stove. He went to the barn. He was there for 3 hours. When he came out, he went inside, found a piece of paper, and wrote 8 words. He left it on the kitchen table. He went to bed. In the morning she found it. The East plot is yours. I apologize. He had written the first 7 words, then added the second sentence because it needed to be said. She read it. She held it. She looked at it for a long time, at the handwriting, which was precise and slightly angular. The handwriting of a man who had learned English as second language, and taken the letters seriously, and had apparently learned the word apologize, and had used it in a sentence, which for a man like Stellan Voss was not a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. She folded the note carefully and put it in the front of the Tennyson, where she kept things she intended to keep. She went to the kitchen. She made breakfast. When Stellan came in, she handed him his coffee. Neither of them said anything, but the thing that had closed between them the day before opened again, quickly, without announcement, the way certain important things do. She was sick by the 4th week of November. It started as a cold, the ordinary winter kind, the kind that makes you slightly miserable for 3 days and then resolves. But it did not resolve, it deepened. On the 3rd day he came in from the morning chores and found her at the kitchen table with a pallor that was wrong. The specific gray-white of a fever, the look he knew, the look he had seen before in this same cabin, in the same month 6 years ago. And his whole body went cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He put his hand on her forehead. "You're sick," he said. "I know. I'll be fine." She was not fine. By evening she was in bed. By midnight the fever was high enough that she was not entirely coherent, not entirely present, drifting in and out of the place where fever takes you, that hot, vertiginous country where everything is slightly too bright and slightly too fast, and the walls of the room seem less reliable than they usually are. Miles City was 90 miles away. The road was snow. He did not go for a doctor. He built the fire up until the room was warm enough and kept it there. He boiled broth from the bones he had saved. He had saved bones without knowing why or without admitting why, and brought it to her every 2 hours. He changed the cloth on her forehead when it warmed. He sat in the chair beside her bed through the first night and the second night and the third, dozing in the chair and waking and checking, and dozing again. On the second night, when she was deepest in the fever, she was restless, troubled by something in the hot country of her sleep. He looked at her face, the tension in it, the slight furrow of the brow, and he picked up the Tennyson from the table where she had left it. He opened it to where she had been reading. He read. His English was learned, not born. He had built it word by word over 20 years, the way you build a fence. Post by post, wire by wire, nothing decorative. Everything functional. Tennyson was not functional English. Tennyson was English that had been bent into shapes that English does not naturally want to occupy. He read it anyway, haltingly, quietly, stopping on the hard words, mispronouncing some of them, probably, not caring, reading because she read it, reading, because it was the only language he could think of that she would recognize from somewhere underneath the fever. Ring out, wild bells, to the wild sky, the flying cloud, the frosty light. The year is dying in the night. Ring out, wild bells, and let him die. He read until his voice gave out, then he sat. He looked at her face. He thought, This came slowly, carefully, the way thoughts come to a man who does not often think directly about himself, he thought. I do not want her to leave. Not in the fever sense. Not in the immediate physical sense. In all the other senses. Every sense. He had been so careful. He had been so precisely, deliberately careful. The contract, the room, the shelf, the carved border that served no structural purpose, all of it calibrated to give her what she needed without asking for anything in return. Without asking for anything at all, because asking felt like the one thing he had not earned the right to do. Because the last time he had had someone in this house to ask things from, she had died in January. And he had buried her in frozen ground alone, and that was the lesson he had taken from love the first time. He had not intended to take a different lesson, but here he was, sitting in a chair at 3 a.m. in November, reading Tennyson badly in a voice that was giving out, because the woman in the bed was sick and the road to Miles City was 90 miles of snow. And she was all he had, and he had not understood, until this moment, that she had become that, all he had, without him noticing, without him permitting it, without him doing anything except walking past her open door in the evenings and finding her in the yard building cold frames and restacking his wood and asking 14 questions and never, not once, stopping to apologize for being exactly the kind of person she was. He looked at her in the firelight. He thought, I have been sitting outside the wall again. He thought, when she gets better, I am going to have to figure out what to do about that. The fever broke on the 4th day. She opened her eyes. He was asleep in the chair. His hand was resting on the edge of her blanket, not touching her, just near. Close enough to feel the warmth of her through the wool. She lay there. She looked at his face in the firelight, the jaw, the closed eyes, the specific stillness of a man who has been awake too long and is now simply where sleep put him. The Tennyson was open on his chest. She could see the page it was open to. She looked at his hand on the edge of her blanket. She thought about what it meant that he had stayed. The broth every 2 hours, the fire kept high, the cloth on her forehead, the chair pulled close enough that he could reach her without waking. She had come to Montana expecting a practical man. She had found this, whatever this was, a man who sat outside the wall and called it not bothering her, a man who read Tennyson badly in the dark, so she would not be alone in the fever, a man who put his hand at the edge of her blanket, not on her, not claiming her, just near, just present, just there. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about Cincinnati, about the school that had closed, the room she had given up. She thought about Denver. She thought about the letter she had written 3 weeks ago and not sent and not burned. The teaching position in Denver that was still technically available. She thought about the note on the kitchen table. The East plot is yours. I apologize. She looked at his hand on the edge of her blanket. She did not wake him. She let him sleep. She lay in the warm room and looked at the firelight on the ceiling and listened to his breathing and thought about what it means when a person who has learned to protect themselves from warmth starts letting it in anyway, not dramatically, not all at once, just a door left open, just a carved border on a pine shelf, just a hand at the edge of a blanket in the dark. She only knew that she was warm and that the room was not empty, and that those two things had stopped being small. He woke an hour later to find her watching him. He straightened in the chair, looked at her. She looked back. You're better, he said. Yes. He reached forward and put his hand briefly on her forehead. Clinical. Checking. Withdrawing before it could become anything else. You should eat, I know. He stood. Moved toward the door. Stellan. He stopped. Turned. She was looking at him with the direct, undefended expression. But there was something else in it now. Something the fever had left behind like a watermark on a page. Visible if you knew how to look. Not visible if you didn't. He could see it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, I'll get the broth, she said. All right, he went to the kitchen. He stood at the stove and looked at the wall for 30 seconds. Then he got the broth. because that was what she needed right now. Because the other thing required a different kind of courage, a kind he had set down in January of 1876 and had not yet fully picked up again. But he was going to, he thought, standing at the stove in November, with the snow pressing against the windows, and the fire going in the next room where she was awake and warm, he thought, I am going to. He just needed a little more time. He was almost there. December came. The snow came with it. Not the tentative early season snow of November, which arrives and then reconsiders. December snow in the Yellowstone Valley is committed. It settles in and makes itself at home, and does not check whether this is convenient for you. The world went white. They were inside more. This changed things. The homestead, which had enough space for two people to exist in separate orbits, contracted with the cold. The barn still needed tending. The cattle still needed checking. But the long riding hours of October became shorter. The evenings became longer. The fire became the center of gravity, around which everything else arranged itself. They read. They sat at opposite ends of the table, each with a book, in the lamplit evenings. The fire talked to itself. Outside, the snow talked to the wind. Inside, the silence between them was comfortable, not empty, the way silence gets between two people who have stopped needing to fill it. She played violin on Sunday evenings. He sat in the kitchen and listened. He did not go to the porch. He stayed inside, and she did not stop. In the third week of December, on a gray Tuesday afternoon while Stellan was out checking the cattle, Beatrix sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and wrote a letter to a school in Denver. She had been thinking about it since before the fever. She had been not thinking about it since the fever broke. She sat down and wrote it anyway, because thinking about something and not doing it are not the same as deciding. And she was a woman who believed in deciding, in naming the thing and looking at it and choosing. So she wrote the letter. Dear Mr. Halloway, I am writing to inquire about the teaching position, advertised in the Cincinnati Enquirer this past spring. I am currently residing in Montana Territory, but remain interested. In the door opened. She looked up. Not Stellan. Aldous Crew. Come in from the cold the way he always came, without knocking, without announcement, like something permanent and unstoppable. He poured himself coffee. He looked at the paper on the table. He did not ask what it was. He sat down across from her. He wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at her the way he looked at everything. Straight on, without diplomacy, with the flat honesty of a man who has been alive long enough to have stopped seeing the point of circumlocution. You thinking about leaving, he said. It was not a question. She did not answer. He looked at his coffee. I've known Stellan Voss 22 years, he said. Knew him when he came from Norway. Knew him when he built this place board by board with 2 hired hands and a mule. He turned the mug in his hands. Knew him when he buried Ragna. Watched him after. He paused. A man can close a room in himself and lock it and throw away the key. Some men do it. You never get them back after. He looked up at her. The morning after you arrived, he built you a shelf with carving. Carving that serves no purpose whatsoever. He picked up his coffee. In 22 years, I have never seen Stellan Voss do one single unnecessary thing. He drank. He stood. He put his hat back on. I'm not telling you what to do, he said. I'm telling you what I know. He went to the door, opened it. The cold came in briefly, sharp and enormous. What you do with it is your business. He left. She sat at the table. She looked at the letter. She looked at the place where the shelf was, in the next room, with the carved border that served no structural purpose, with the Tennyson in the front cover, where she kept things she intended to keep, with the 2 notes from Stellan. The East plot is yours, and I apologize. Folded and held there. She folded the letter. She did not send it. She did not burn it. She put it on the shelf, in her room, behind the book on agricultural science, where she would have to actively retrieve it to do anything with it. Stellan came in from the cold an hour later, red-faced, stamping snow from his boots. She handed him his coffee. He took it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither said anything. But something had shifted. He could feel it. He could not name it. He sat down at the table. She sat down across from him, and the fire talked to itself, and the snow talked to the wind, and outside the December dark came down over the Yellowstone Valley like a held breath, and inside, two people sat across from each other and did not say a word, and it was enough. For now, it was enough. Christmas morning came quietly, the way the best things come, without announcement, without fanfare, just there when you opened your eyes. The world outside the window gone entirely white, the snow having made its decision sometime in the night and committed to it fully. The Beartooth Range invisible behind cloud, the valley erased to its essentials, just white and gray and the dark line of the creek and the pale sky above everything, holding more snow in reserve. Stellan woke at 5. As he always did, the body's habit, the ranch's requirement. Nothing to do with what day it was, because the cattle did not observe Christmas, and neither, for the last 6 years, had he dressed. He came out of his room. He stopped. The cabin had changed overnight, not in the dramatic way, not in the way of things purchased from stores, because the nearest store was 90 miles away and buried under the same snow as everything else, but changed, completely, irrevocably. Pine branches on the mantel, cut from the tree line behind the barn, which meant she had gone out in the dark, before he woke, with a knife and a lantern. Candle stubs pressed into the lids of mason jars and arranged along the windowsill, 3 of them already burning, the flames steady in the still interior air. Lengths of red fabric tied to the pine branches in bows. He looked at the fabric. He recognized it. It was from the petticoat she had arrived in. The blue traveling dress's petticoat, deep red, cut into strips and folded into bows and tied onto branches. She had cut in the dark at 5 in the morning on Christmas Day, and on the table, a plate, round, pale, dusted with powdered sugar. Small round cookies, dense, fragrant with ginger and cardamom and anise, the specific complicated warmth of a spice combination that his nose recognized before his mind did. German spice cookies, Pfeffernuss. He stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. He did not move. She had packed those spices before she had any reason to believe this would be a place worth celebrating anything in. Before she knew him. Before the shelf and the cold frame and the east pasture and the fever and all of it. She had packed the spices anyway. Because it was going to be Christmas somewhere, and wherever she was going to make it warm. He heard her in the kitchen. The sound of the stove. Her footsteps, deliberate, purposeful. The footsteps of a woman who moves through space like she means to be there. She came out of the kitchen and stopped. She had not expected him to be up yet. They looked at each other. She was wearing her wool dress, the practical December one, and her hair was slightly disordered from going outside in the dark, and there was powdered sugar on her left sleeve from the cookies, and she was holding a coffee pot with both hands. He looked at the room. He looked at her. He said, "You did this," she said. "It is Christmas." A pause. "Even in Montana," she added. Like that needed clarifying. He went back to his room. She watched him go. She set the coffee pot on the table. She looked at the door he had gone through. She thought, and this was the thought, the one she had been not having for 3 months, the one that kept arriving at the edges of her mind and getting sent away. He is not going to. He doesn't. It's fine. It is fine. This is a business arrangement, and it is working, and the east plot is hers, and the bookshelf has 3 shelves and a carved border. And that is, he came back out. He was carrying a box, small, wooden. He had made it himself. She could see that. The same hand planing as the shelf. The same deliberate joinery of a man who takes the construction of things seriously. He carried it to the table and set it down beside the plate of Pfeffernuss. He did not say anything. She looked at the box. She looked at him. He nodded at it. She set down the coffee pot. She opened the box. Inside, on a bed of folded cloth, was a set of violin strings. 4 of them. New. Cut strings, good ones. The kind you had to order from a supplier in Chicago or St. Louis. The kind that did not exist within 90 miles of this homestead. She lifted one carefully, held it to the light from the candles on the windowsill. When, she said, October, he said, rode to Billings to get them. She looked at him. You rode to Billings to get them? Yes, Billings was 42 miles. In October, before the snow. He had ridden 84 miles round trip, for violin strings, for Ragna's violin, for the violin on the bookshelf between the Tennyson and the agricultural science book. She set the string down carefully. Stellan, she said. He said nothing. He was looking at the mantel, at the pine branches, at the small, careful labor of what she had made of this morning, before he was awake. She waited. She had learned this, the way he approached the things that mattered, the way he circled them. Came close, withdrew, came back. The way a man comes back to the shelf in the barn, 10,000 times before he picks up the case. He said, Ragna played badly. She went very still, she knew it. Played anyway, a pause, every Sunday evening. I used to sit on the porch to listen. He looked at the mantel, at the pine. If I sat inside, she would stop. She thought she was bothering me. He stopped. She wasn't. The room was very quiet. The candles burned steadily. I sat on the porch, he said, for 6 years of Sundays. Because I was afraid that if I went in, she would stop. He was quiet for a long moment. And then there were no more Sundays. He turned and looked at her. She would have liked you, he said. Not because you are similar. You are not, a pause. Because you are both too honest for your own good. And neither of you ever stopped playing because someone was listening. Beatrix looked at him. She thought about 6 years of Sundays. About a man sitting on a porch in the Montana cold, listening through a log wall, because he was afraid that going inside would make the music stop. She thought about every door she had left open. Every evening she had played with the door open. Maybe she had been leaving every door open, because she wanted him to come in. She looked at the violin strings on the table. 84 miles. In October. Before he knew if she was staying, she said, in German, we have a word. Geborgenheit, he looked at her. It means the feeling of being safe inside the warm, of being held without being held, of being, she stopped. There isn't an English translation. No, he said. Does Norwegian have? Koselek, he said. She waited, the warmth when the world outside is cold. He looked around the room, the pine branches, the candles, the red bows from her petticoat, the cookies, the box he had carried out of his room. Being home when home is far away, he looked at her. This, what you made this morning. This is Koselag. She looked at him. Her eyes filled. She did not look away. He did not look away either. They stood on opposite sides of the table. The plate of pfeffernusse between them. The box of violin strings. The candles on the windowsill, throwing warm light across everything. Not touching. Not needing to. The words had been said, both of them, in 2 languages. And they meant the same thing, exactly the same thing. Which meant that somewhere between Norway and Germany, between a farm in the Yellowstone Valley and a teaching position in Cincinnati, between a letter that described a woman like livestock and a letter that came back saying, send her, somewhere in all of that 2 people had been walking toward the same word without knowing it. Until now, Koselleck. Geborgenheit, the door was open. Neither of them was going to close it. She found the letter in the afternoon. She had genuinely forgotten it. The fever, the recovery, Aldous Crew's visit, the days leading up to Christmas, with the spices and the fabric, and the pine branches in the dark at 5 in the morning. All of it had pushed the letter to Denver, to the back of her mind, where things go when they stop being urgent. She had not burned it. She had put it behind the agricultural science book on the shelf, and sometime in the afternoon on Christmas Day, when she went to her room to get her shawl, she looked at the shelf and remembered. The letter was right where she had put it, in her own handwriting, on paper she had folded and not sent and not destroyed. Dear Mr. Halloway. She looked at it. She thought about what it meant that she had not sent it. She thought about what it meant that she had not burned it either. And then she came out of her room and found Stellan at the kitchen table. He looked up. She sat down across from him. She put the letter on the table between them. He looked at it. He looked at her handwriting on the front. He looked at the Denver address. He did not say, "What is this?" He knew what it was. She could tell he knew, which meant he had seen it before. On the shelf. Maybe weeks ago. Maybe more. And he had not asked. Had not mentioned it. Had not said a word. She said, "You knew?" He said nothing. "How long?" He looked at the table. "A while. And you didn't say anything." "It's your decision," he said. "Not mine." She looked at him. He looked at the letter. "If you want to go," he said. And his voice was level. It was very level. It was the voice of a man who is holding something in very carefully. "I'll drive you to the station myself." A pause. 90 miles, he said. "In the snow." "I'll drive you." She looked at his face, at the jaw, which was better in person than in the photograph. She had said that at the station in September, and had meant it as an observation. And it was true. It was simply true. And she had been noticing it every day. Since in the way you notice things you have given up, pretending not to notice. She looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had built the shelf, that had fixed the cold frame angle, that had turned the pages of Tennyson at 3 in the morning in a voice that was giving out, that had rested on the edge of her blanket in the dark, not claiming her. "Just near," he said, "but I want you to know." He stopped. She waited. He looked at the letter. "This stopped being a transaction," he said. "The day you restacked my wood, the room was very quiet. The fire talked to itself. Outside, Christmas in Montana, covering the world in a deep considered silence. The kind of silence that is not empty, but is full of what has been said and what is about to be said, and what does not need to be said because it is already understood." She reached across the table. She picked up the letter. She stood. She walked to the stove. She opened the door of the firebox. She held the letter for 1 second. Just one. Not hesitation. Acknowledgement. The way you acknowledge a road you chose not to take, briefly, before you walk the one you did. She put the letter in the fire. It caught immediately. Curled at the edges the way paper does. Went bright and then dark and then ash. She closed the firebox door. She turned. He was watching her. She said, "Stellan," just his name. He said, "I know." She sat back down across from him. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. They drank. Outside. Christmas in Montana held the world in white and cold and enormous silence. Inside, 2 people sat across from each other at a kitchen table. And it was enough. It was completely enough. Reverend Posky arrived on January 6, 1883. Stellan had written to him in November, a letter so terse it barely qualified as communication. Ceremony needed, January if possible. Voss Homestead, Yellowstone Valley. 2 people, Reverend Posky, who had been riding circuit through Montana Territory for 11 years and had performed ceremonies in circumstances that most ordained ministers would consider irregular, had written back equally briefly, "Will try." Weather permitting. The weather, on January 6, 1883, did not permit in the conventional sense. It was snowing hard by mid-morning, the kind of snow that has made a decision, the kind that does not care about your schedule. Pasky arrived at noon anyway. He came out of the white like an apparition. A lean man of 60, black coat, frost-covered beard, on a gray horse that looked equally committed to the enterprise. He came to the door and knocked. Stellan opened it. Pasky looked at him. "Voss, Pasky, it's snowing. I know, I rode through it anyway." "I can see that. You're welcome." He came inside. He looked around the cabin, the bookshelf with its 3 shelves and carved border, the pine branches still on the mantel from Christmas, the violin on the second shelf, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and something baking that was Beatrix's contribution to the morning. He looked at Beatrix, who was standing in the kitchen doorway. He looked back at Stellan. "Well," he said. That was all. Alda's crew had come the night before, 60 miles through cold, because Stellan had written to him equally briefly. Witness needed. January 6th. Aldous had arrived with a bottle of whiskey and an expression of profound satisfaction that he was making no effort to conceal. The ceremony was in the cabin. Because of course it was. Where else would it be? Stellan stood near the window, the snow outside still coming, thick and serious. He had dressed in his best coat, which was not his best coat, by any absolute standard, but was his best coat. In the sense that it was the one with no visible ears, he had also combed his hair. This had taken longer than the rest of his preparations combined. Beatrix came out of her room, blue dress. Not the traveling dress from September, a different blue, darker, the wool dress. She had packed for something she had not yet known she would be doing. Her hair done differently, more formal, more deliberate. She was not carrying flowers because it was January in Montana. And flowers were not available in January in Montana. But she was holding something, a small sprig of dried lavender she had kept in her trunk since Cincinnati, pressed flat and fragrant even dried. She walked across the room. She stopped beside Stellan. She looked at his hair. She said very quietly, "You combed it," he said equally quietly. "Don't." She pressed her lips together, which was the expression she used when she was not going to say the thing she was thinking, which happened approximately never, which meant this was a special occasion, which, granted it was. Reverend Posposk opened his Bible. He looked at the two of them. "Ready?" he said. Beatrix looked at Stellan. Stellan looked at Beatrix. Neither of them said yes, because yes was too small for it. Pask, who had been doing this for 11 years in Montana territory and understood when a silence was an answer, began. The vows were short. This was, in retrospect, appropriate. Two people who had communicated primarily through carved bookshelves and restacked wood piles and folded notes and badly read Tennyson and violin music through log walls did not require elaborate verbal declaration. The vows were short. The promises were real. Aldous stood against the wall, with his arms crossed and his bottle of whiskey, and the expression of profound satisfaction that he was still making no effort to conceal. On the bookshelf between the Tennyson and the agricultural science book, the violin stood 12 books. 3 shelves. Carved border. No structural purpose. Outside, January in Montana, 1883. Snow on the valley. Snow on the hills. The Beartooth Range holding itself invisible behind white. Inside warm, Kosalaka. Geborgenheit when it was done. Posk closed the Bible and looked at them. "Well," he said. Again. And then Aldous Crew, who had ridden 60 miles through January cold and had been waiting with considerable impatience for this moment, said, "Somebody take a cookie. I'm opening the whiskey." They ranched the Yellowstone Valley for 42 years. This is not a long time, measured against mountains. Against everything else it is enormous. 5 children. 3 sons. 2 daughters. All of them taught to read before they were 5. Beatrix's rule, non-negotiable, applied with the same systematic thoroughness. She applied to wood piles and cold frames and the south-facing angle of anything that needed the winter sun. All of them taught to work before they were 7. Stellan's rule, equally non-negotiable, applied with the same quiet expectation that competence was not optional and that the land did not grade on sentiment. The bookshelf grew. 3 shelves in 1882, 6 by 1890, 9 by 1900. The 9-shelf version filled the entire north wall of the room they eventually consciously called the library, which had started as the second bedroom and expanded as the house expanded, which it did twice in the first decade, because 5 children require space, and Stellan built the way he did everything. Carefully, correctly, with more care than strictly necessary. Every shelf had the carved border. Every one. No structural purpose. Just the particular extravagance of a man who had learned, late, that not everything needed to be functional to be necessary. Beatrix played violin on Sunday evenings until 1931, when her hands made it impossible. Arthritis. The gradual closing of the joints. The specific cruelty of an ailment that takes from you the thing you most need your hands for. She played the last time on a Sunday in November of that year. The children were grown. The house was quieter than it had been for 40 years. She played one piece, the Norwegian folk song she had learned on the train from Cincinnati, from the old man with the wooden flute. She played it slowly, finding her way through the melody, the same way she had found it the first time. Stellan sat in the kitchen, not on the porch. Inside, he had sat. Inside since Christmas morning, 1882. Since the pine branches and the candles and the pfeffernuss and the two words in two languages that meant the same thing. He had sat inside for 49 years of Sundays. He never went back to the porch. When she finished and put the violin down for the last time, he came into the room. He sat beside her. He took her hands in his, the hands that had restacked his wood and built the cold frame and written 14 questions on the ride from Billings, and folded a letter to Denver, and then burned it. And he held them. He did not say anything. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say, or rather everything had already been said. Over 49 years. In two languages and one long silence and carved bookshelves, and 84 miles on horseback. For violin strings and notes, left on kitchen tables and doors, left open, and hands resting at the edge of blankets in the dark. Everything had been said, many times, in the only language that mattered, which was not language at all. Stellan Voss died in March of 1924, 77 years old, in his own bed, in the house he had built and expanded, and repaired for 43 years. In the valley he had farmed through 11 years of drought and 2 bad winters, and 1 cattle crisis in 1893 that had nearly taken everything and did not, because 2 people were working the same problem from opposite sides, and between them they had enough. The doctor from Miles City. There was a doctor in Miles City now, and the road was not 90 miles of snow anymore. Said it was his heart. Beatrix, who was 71 and had no patience for euphemism, said, of course it was his heart. His heart worked very hard for a very long time. She buried him on the hill behind the homestead, the hill that faced south, that caught the winter sun, that looked down over the entire valley, the creek, the east pasture, the barn with its repaired roof, the kitchen garden with its cold frame, the house with its library wall of 9 shelves. She stood at the grave for a long time. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. She cried. Then she went back inside. She put the Tennyson on the table. She opened it to the front cover. Inside, in the careful angular handwriting of a man who had learned English as a second language and taken the letters seriously, was his name. He had written it there, sometime in the first weeks. She had never known exactly when. S. Voss. Just his initials and his name, on the front page of her book, in the same place she kept the things she intended to keep. She looked at it. She closed the book. She put it back on the shelf with the carved border. The 9-shelf version of the pine shelf he had built the morning after she arrived, before he knew if she was staying, before he knew if she read, before he knew anything about her except that she had asked for one, and he had a reason he was not yet admitting to himself to give her more than she asked for. She lived until 1939. 87 years old, she outlasted the shelf in the barn, the violin case with the brass latches, and the scratch along the left side, and the initials RV, which had been moved to the library years ago, given a proper place, acknowledged as what it was, not a wound kept in storage, but a beginning. The beginning of a man learning to let something in again. She outlasted the cold frame, which had been rebuilt 3 times. She outlasted the original woodpile, obviously. She outlasted 5 decades of Montana winters and 2 world wars and a depression, and the Northern Pacific, changing everything about what it meant to live at the edge of the world. She did not outlast the bookshelf. The bookshelf was still there when her youngest daughter cleared the house in the autumn of 1939. Still against the north wall, 9 shelves. Pine, hand-planed, carved border on every one. The youngest daughter, Ingrid, named for a feeling that did not have a name in English, stood in front of it for a long time. She ran her finger along the carved border. She had grown up with this shelf, had pulled her first book off it at age 4, had been taught to read in this room, by this light, by a woman who believed that literacy was not optional, and that the world owed you nothing, but would give you considerably more if you could read it. She had never once, in all her years, thought to ask why the border was carved, why it was there, what it meant. She stood there and looked at it, and she understood. The way you understand certain things only after the people who could have explained them are gone. She understood that this shelf was not furniture. It had never been furniture. It was a sentence. A sentence her father had spoken the morning after a stranger arrived at our doorstep in a blue dress that was slightly too fine for the surroundings, carrying 2 suitcases and a violin, and said 14 things to him in 45 minutes, and negotiated her own terms, and went to sleep in a strange room, in a strange house, in a strange territory, and played Brahms quietly through the wall so she would not disturb him. A sentence he had carved into pine, because he did not yet have words for it, because he was not ready, because some doors you approach slowly. But you approach them. You keep approaching them, until one morning you pick up the case. You carry it inside. You set it on the shelf, and you leave it there for someone else to find. They are buried on the hill, side by side, looking down over the valley they built together, the creek still running east, the Beartooth Range still holding itself on the southern horizon, exactly where it has always been, enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to human concerns. Except the concerns, it turns out, were not small, were not, in the end, insignificant. A man wrote a letter that described a woman like livestock, and the woman arrived and refused to be what he had written. And what they built was better than either of them had planned. Because the best things are never the things you ordered. They are the things that show up in a blue dress trellis, and restack your wood and ask you 14 questions and play violin through the wall at night, and negotiate their own terms, and burn a letter to Denver in your kitchen stove on Christmas morning. They are the things that refuse to stop playing just because someone is listening. They are the things that leave the door open and wait, and trust that eventually, in his own time, in his own way, at his own pace, which is the pace of a man who builds shelves carefully and planes by hand when he could use a rougher method, and adds carved borders that serve no structural purpose whatsoever. Eventually, he will come inside. He came inside. For 49 years of Sundays, he never went back to the porch.